Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right to podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to the Aspire podcast. I'm Katie, Executive Director of I Have the Right To, and filling in for Chessie is our Communications Director, Maria. Welcome back, Maria.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
As a reminder, Aspire was created by the nonprofit I Have the Right To as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. If these conversations resonate with you and you're interested in bringing them into your school or community, we'd love to connect. I Have the Right To partners with K-12 schools, colleges, and universities to provide age-appropriate programming for students, educators, and parents on consent, healthy relationships, digital safety, leadership, and more, helping turn these conversations into action. You can reach us at takeaction@ihavetherightto.org. And before Maria introduces today's guest, I want to take a moment to introduce our co-host, Ryan. Ryan is an 8th grade student and an intern at I Have the Right To. We are so happy to have you with us today, Ryan.
Thank you, Katie. I'm happy to be here.
We intentionally include youth voices in every episode because young people are not just the audience for this work, they are central to shaping it. Their perspectives keep our conversations grounded in real experience, challenge assumptions, and help ensure that what we're talking about is actually resonating with the communities we aim to serve. And now I'm going to hand it over to Maria to introduce and welcome today's guest.
Today, we're honored to welcome Dr. Susan Osborn, a prominent voice in gender, literature, and cultural criticism, an award-winning author, educator, and mentor. Her work bridges feminism, scholarship, activism, and storytelling. She also challenges deeply embedded systems that shape what survivors are allowed to know, say, and be believed about their own experiences. Dr. Osborn is also the director of the Writing Center of Princeton. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Village Voice, American Scholar, and Mothering. Her acclaimed books include Surviving the Wreck, a novel, and Elizabeth Bowen, New Critical Perspective. In her latest book, She's Social Liar, Incest, Knowledge and Power, Dr. Osborn offers a powerful and necessary critique of how incest has been historically diminished as a private family matter, rather than recognized as a systemic and societal injustice. Through her writing, teaching, and advocacy, she brings hidden truths into public conversations and asks us to confront the structures that allow violence and silence to persist. Her works closely align with the mission of I Have the Right to center survivor voices, challenge harmful norms, and create lasting change. We're so grateful to have her here with us today.
Thank you very much, Maria. I appreciate that welcome, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Before we begin, I would like to thank I Have the Right To for the excellent service that you're providing and have been providing for some time. And I think it's especially important right now as we're seeing increasing feminist backlash and increasing attempts by people in power to deny sexual violence and deny women's rights to bodily autonomy and control. So thank you. It really is an honor to be with this organization.
To start, can you take us back to the beginning of your journey? What drew you to studying power, gender, and violence, and what led you to become an advocate?
Yes, that would take hours to explain if I was comprehensive. Um, but let me just start by saying I've been interested in sexual violence against girls and women and our culture's indifference to it for decades. And what has struck me over time is not just the prevalence of the violence, but the lack of sustained outrage to it. So I chose to focus on incest primarily, but not exclusively, because it is, by most estimates, the most common form of sexual violence against girls. Conservative estimates, and I mean very conservative estimates, indicate that at least 1 in 6 girls will be incestuously abused and experience sexual violence prepubescently. But we know that that number is much higher because most cases of incest are never reported. So I want to put this in some kind of context. If Maria, if 1 in 6 girls suddenly developed a disfiguring facial condition, we we would be outraged. Right? We would do something about it. We would recognize the problem. We would at least try to do something about the problem. We would try to fix it and we would try to eliminate the problem. But we see no comparable outrage where incest is concerned. And that led me to ask, what makes something so widespread so unspeakable?
That is an amazing answer, putting it into perspective like that. It is insane that.
It's not just a figure, it's a reality.
You recently released your book, She's Such a Liar, a title that's both very striking and provocative. What does that phrase mean to you, and what are you naming or challenging through that book?
Um, she's such a liar. Isn't that um, and, what did you call it, Ryan? Did you call it a provocative title? Uh,
Yes.
I don't see it as provocative at all. I see it as a commonplace phrase that's used on women and girls who say, "I have experienced sexual violence." And it takes different forms, Ryan. She's a liar, she's hysterical, she's crazy, it's all a hoax. These are all forms of discrediting the survivor's testimony. So it seemed the obvious title for a book that was examining power and knowledge systems and how they've been discrediting and suppressing survivor voices really for millennia.
For listeners who are being introduced to work, can you share a brief overview of the book and what you hope people take away from it before we dive into a little deeper conversations?
You want my elevator pitch? It sounds like right? Which I could read off my board here if I could get to it. But look, she's such a liar. Um, Ask the question, why is incest so often disbelieved and minimized and hidden? And I draw on feminist analysis and cultural analysis to examine the legal, the medical, and the social systems that we recognize as truth, um, and whose voices have been heard. In other words, Ryan, the longer answer to your question would be this. The question that I wanted to explore is, why is something so prevalent? Minimum of 1 in 6, but we know it's much higher. Why is that so absent from the public mind? It's the driving force behind the book. And of course, when I started the book, I thought, well, prudery. Prudery is the obvious answer, right? But, I'm an older woman and prudery never made much sense to me. And it became less sense.
Excuse
Yeah.
me? Sorry, I just want to say 30 isn't that old.
Um, all right, now that you've thrown me off, I have to regain my place here. But anyway, so when I talk to women informally about my interest in incest and my research, their reception to me surprised me. They welcomed the conversation. And as I talked more, I almost felt that they were waiting for the conversation, as if they were waiting for permission to talk openly to someone about their experiences of incest or a family member's experience of incest. So the prudery theory that I never quite believed, it didn't hold up. So I had to dig deeper. And my assumption was that we live in a misogynistic, patriarchal, male supremacist culture. And I had to ask myself, were there, I called them core systems, were there ordinary institutional arrangements that supported and maintained incest's invisibility? And what I discovered is that the silence that shrouds incest has very little, almost nothing to do with prudery. Instead, it has a lot to do with the long-standing institutional suppression of victims' voices by the legal and medical professions, and especially the medical profession. In other words, the silence, that apparent indifference that I was wondering about, it's not accidental. It protects those in power. It preserves the authority of the perpetrators, and it shields the institutions themselves from accountability.
Susan, I would love to hear from you the two different definitions, if you don't mind. So, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the word prudery, if you could explain what that means. And then also, what exactly does incest encompass? I think most people think of it as sexual abuse by a family member. Is it that? Is it wider than that? Can you dive into both of that a little bit more?
No, to answer your second question, that is it. It's sexual violence that occurs within a family. And prudery simply means a discomfort with talking about quote unquote not nice subjects, whether it be, we don't talk about religion, we don't talk about disease, we don't talk about, icky things like sexual violence. It's just we don't talk about not nice things, with nice having very broad definition.
It's interesting, as you know, I spent over a decade representing survivors of sexual abuse, mostly survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And, the myth that I think a lot of people want to believe about sexual abuse is that it occurs by a stranger, that somebody is
Mhm.
going to jump out of a alleyway and grab you. And granted, those things do happen, but in the hundreds and hundreds of cases that I had as an attorney for about 11 or 12 years, I never had that case. I never had a case where it was a stranger. It was
Yeah.
always somebody that they knew, and a lot of times somebody that they trusted. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head. Why we don't talk about these things is that it's a way to maintain power and control. I think that's one of the reasons why we try to have these important conversations like the one we're having right now, because the more we talk about it, the more we take it out of the shadow and shine light on it and take away some of that power from the people who want to silence it. And I think incest has been, people don't want to talk about sexual abuse or sexual violence at all, but then incest is, a category within that somehow has even more, maybe, I don't know if the word is shame, or people don't want to talk about it. But I found the same as you. As soon as people learn about the work that I'm doing, they share experiences with me that they had growing up. And it's often abuse by a family member. And like you said, I think they were just waiting for somebody to feel safe to talk about it with. And it's always surprising, when those conversations come up. I've had it come up like in the back of a cab when somebody asks me what kind of work I do. I've had it come up with family members. But you speak so powerfully about society's indifference to sexual violence, especially when it comes to incest. So, why do you think something so prevalent remains so absent from the public mind? Is it absent? Is it that we just don't want to talk about it? And have you seen a shift in the willingness to talk about it?
I've seen the beginning of a shift, Katie. But I think to really see a shift, um, let me stop there and talk about the shift first. There is a growing number, there seems to be a growing number of um, women who are pushing back against the system and who are um, disrupting and subverting the system with their narratives. And I think that that's essential work that's being done right now. That disruption makes their voices politically and culturally significant. But I think to really get to a deeper level of understanding, um, and to a level where we can really, let's say, um, open up the issue of incest is by reframing it. And some people have suggested that my book is about reframing incest as a um, systemic crime. I think you mentioned this, Maria, in the introduction. But I'm not replacing one frame with another. Rather, incest is not either a private family tragedy or a systemic issue. It's a both. It's a deeply intimate harm that happens within families, and it's a systemically protected crime. But I think, Maria, because we're used to thinking in binaries, people often hear my claim as an either or, right? But that misses the point. Let me try to explain further. When we widen the lens, when we see not just what happens within families, we begin to see how the legal and medical professions and social systems produce, permit, protect, and perpetuate incest. And for centuries, professional institutions have strategically, as I mentioned earlier, discredited those who speak. And there's been a whole machinery of disbelief created that routinely upholds the authority of perpetrators over that of the victims. And we see this in court cases repeatedly. And that's the reframing that I'm trying to talk about throughout the book. That when we move from seeing incest as exclusively as an isolated incest incident of family secret, we start to recognize a pattern that is institutionally organized and maintained.
One thing I just want to point out is just to me, it's so inspiring how dedicated you are to this. Like, it's honestly like I love to see that. I think that's so great.
I appreciate that because um, when I first started, uh, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that, Ryan, because when I started marketing this book, I was getting really wonky responses. And I'll just tell you one, the very famous agent in New York to whom I had been recommended by one of her clients, um, wrote back after she had read the manuscript, and she said, "Wow, I love your voice, you know." You have a really strong and compelling voice. But to write a book about incest, we would have to do it without using the word incest. We don't want to offend anyone's biases. And I, I was rather flustered, as it appears you are, Ryan, by that word biases. And I knew I wouldn't get a response back. She was just basically saying, I don't want to go near incest. But I did write back to her just one word question, biases, question mark. And of course, I got no response. So, and I had one editor, um, I have this is permissible. I mean, it's scientific jargon that I'm about to use. It's biological jargon, but um, I had another editor, an agent, say to me, "Well, you've missed the boat here, with all your focus on institutional suppression." She said, "Because it's the vagina that causes incest." Yeah, I know. Katie's eyes are going up and wrapping around the back of her head. And I said, what could I say? I said, I'm sorry, I disagree. I don't think my vagina causes incest.
It's making me think about the power of words in general and
Yeah,
how we assign value to words and what words we say are unspeakable. And it's a different conversation, Susan, but I wonder if you think that it relates. I mean, one of the big things, I have little kids, right? One of the first things I taught them are the accurate names for their body parts, right? But
right.
there's so much shame around any of these words. And if we refuse to allow people to use these words because of the shame that we associate with them, then how are they supposed to articulate what happens to them, right? Like when
Exactly.
we as a society are saying, don't say that word, or don't name your book that, Susan, or,
Right,
little
right,
Billy, don't refer to your private parts as a penis, because God
right.
forbid you use that word. We're giving power to the people who want to silence it. And so it's just
To
interesting. Or even when people don't want to
suppressors.
use the word consent, right? Or sex or
Right.
any of it, by taking that away, we think that we're somehow, purifying our culture and keeping our kids innocent. But really, I think we're putting them in harm's way. So I'd love
No,
to hear your
I
feedback on that.
completely agree, and it's something, if you'll permit me, that I wanted to talk about, because anyone who has read the book knows that language plays a very large role in my book. Um, and um, I let's see, how shall I start this? Let me start with an anecdote. We did not have the term date rape when I was a teenager or an undergraduate. I don't think it came into the general public discourse until I was in my 30s. And Gloria Steinem, the wonderful feminist, who's in her 90s and going strong still, um, was asked decades later, "What did you call date rape before you had the name date rape?" To which she responded, and I'm wondering if you can guess, Ryan.
Um,
Here, this is an eighth
I'm
grade
trying to
pop
think.
quiz.
Yeah.
Sorry to put you on
um,
the spot.
no, you're good.
Coolest
You're
eighth
good.
grader I know, I have to say.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Um, that's should have studied for this.
You can
Hmm.
buzz letter E, which is no contest, and raise the white flag.
What about
I raised the
a
white
bad
flag.
night instead of date rape?
Yeah,
Or
something
a
so it's something like that, a bad night. But actually what Steinem said was we called it just life. Yeah, Ryan, I hope you spread this conversation all over your campus. Yeah, it was just life. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember those days of just life, you know? But if we think about it, Katie was talking about the importance of words, and language doesn't just describe reality. It determines what we're able to see, and I think that's what Katie is saying to her children. But with incest, we still don't have an adequate vocabulary or even a basic vocabulary to describe it. I mean, think about it, Ryan. We have names for the perpetrators of other forms of sexual violence, right? Harvey Weinstein, he's a rapist, right? He raped. Andrew Cuomo, we call him a sexual harasser. He sexually harassed. Jeffrey Epstein was a sexual trafficker and a rapist. You know, what do we say? He trafficked and raped. So the language there clearly names the crime and the person who committed it. But what do we call the father who sexually exploits his daughter or daughters? We don't have any. And that's my point. The absence, the linguistic omission, eclipses him from our sight. It decouples him from any suspicion of criminal behavior. Honestly, it harbors and abets a criminal. And the absence does even more work at a different level because it helps maintain our culture's long cherished and deeply held ideas about the innocence, virtue, and moral superiority of fathers. I mean, we don't even have a verb that distinguishes what he did from what Cuomo did, let's say.
The way I just want to say the way my body, like, when we were leading up to that, the way my body just, like, went in shock when I realized what we were going to, like,
It's
that's so crazy.
unbelievable. What and what work, Ryan, keep your brain going. I'm sorry, I'm an ex-teacher. Keep your brain going. What work does that linguistic absence do? So, what I say in the book is that we need to name him and name the behavior in a way that makes it clear that this form of sexual violence is different than other forms. And I suggest that we could have another pop quiz here, Ryan, but I don't want to put you through it. But
I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready.
what I suggest in the book is incestor, the father who commits sexual violence against his daughter, and the verb form to incest, as in he incested her for years. And we can have a little fun with this, Ryan. We have to be a little careful with the example that I chose to use for this interview. But if we just take the Mia Farrow and Dylan Farrow situation, we could say with accuracy the allegation made by Mia Farrow's daughter, Dylan, against her alleged incestor, her father, has been described as very compelling. Or Ronan Farrow, Mia's half-brother, has publicly stated that he unequivocally supports his sister's allegation that the person she names incested her. And once we do this, we make it much harder to dismiss, much harder to obscure, and harder to deny incest.
It also takes the language too and flips it. I mean, that's one thing that I learned as an attorney, right? When you're writing the complaint, you don't say she was raped, you say he raped her. And
Yep.
so by having that language, we can also put the blame where it belongs. And so that's
Exactly.
because we have the wording then, we have the ability to say it. But right now, we don't even have the common understanding of what those how to use those words. And so I
That's
agree with you. I think it's so important.
And
that's right.
it's perverse. I was just thinking about it because English is not my first language. I speak Spanish originally. And so the way that you organize the sentence is not, he committed incest. And incest is this sort of nebulous idea that you don't know
Very
who
good.
did it. No,
Yes.
it's incredible. It changes everything.
Yes, it changes everything. I completely agree. And I hope that we'll all begin using it as of today, because I think it's very important. I found it first used outside of my book in an Amazon review written by a man. And I was so happy, he just used it naturally. And it made me very happy. It made me feel like I had made a contribution.
What kind of Amazon review was that?
Customer review written by Dad, a man even, who wrote a very nice review of the book, um, on Amazon,
That's
and didn't
incredible.
make a big deal out of it either, just used incested in the middle of his sentence, didn't explain it, you know, and I thought, "Wow, it might become part of the public discourse." And I agree with you, Maria. I'm not sure. I think in the book I say, we're creating a neologism really do much. Um, it might create a wee chink in the wall of patriarchy, but it's a beginning, and I hope it foments thinking in students like Ryan and advocates. Um, so that they begin to think, yes, incest is different, and we need to understand its difference, and we need to develop ways to talk about it.
I would love to hear more because you were explaining that it is not a dichotomy, it is a relationship between silence, power, knowledge. Is this idea that it's something that is within the private sphere, but it's also protected by other powers, medical powers, legal powers. How do these forces work together to keep incest hidden?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you asked that question, because we often explain the silence around incest as the consequence of shame. Right? Whose shame? The daughter's shame. But this puts the burden on that person who's already been harmed. The shame belongs on Jeffrey Epstein, for heaven's sakes, not on those tenacious survivors, you know. Um, and I found, again, I believe I mentioned earlier, that the silence is actually structured, manufactured by powerful systems that get to determine what counts as knowledge, truth, and what doesn't. And you mentioned the medical system, the one that has the greatest claim of all professions on our trust, has had a very large role to play in this. And to find out more, read my book. But let me explain this by way of a curious anecdote. We all know the name Sigmund Freud. Yes, Ryan? Okay. You've heard of the guy at least. Okay. And Freud spent the beginning part of his career um, listening to young women tell him about experiences of incestuous violence committed by their fathers, their older brothers, uncles, grandfathers. And he took the accounts of incest seriously. Not only did he take the accounts very seriously, but he attributed a great deal of psychic and physical distress to these experiences. And most of all, he was astonished by the sheer number of women who were reporting incestuous violence to him. So he collected data, he wrote it into a report, prepared a presentation, and filled with enthusiasm, this is the mid-19th century, headed to the much lauded Society for Psychiatry and Neurology at the University of Vienna. But instead of being showered with praise, Maria, his words were met with silence. And on the way out of the hall, the head of the Department of Neurology pulled him aside and warned him against publishing fairy tales. So what did Freud do? Freud went home and he sulked. And he realized that his ideas had threatened the authority of the emerging field of psychiatry, right? It was just emerging at that time. We'd had neurology for a long time, but psychiatry as sort of a subsection and now an independent section was new at that time. And also he worried about his position in this new field. And so he thought and he thought and he thought and he thought, and he talked to a lot of people. But before I go on with Freud's story, I want to interrupt my own anecdote to say that what really happened is that the women's testimony about incest that he was reporting was perceived to threaten the authority of the emerging profession. It wasn't his ideas. All he was doing is being the messenger, yes, of the women's truth. That was perceived to threaten the authority of the emerging profession. Now, unfortunately, Freud didn't put this together and say, God, I wonder if there are a lot of incestors in that society. And maybe that's why I ought to shut up. No, he went home, and after sulking for a very long time, he reversed course. And he reframed his own ideas, casting daughters as unreliable narrators of their own experiences. Basically, he called them liars who were bent on revenge against their fathers. And we see this pattern happening over and over in history and to this day. And it matters, for it shows that the silence that you asked about is produced when powerful institutions like the medical establishment get to determine what counts as truth and what doesn't. And that's why we need organizations like I Have the Right to.
You teed up my next question perfectly, Susan. Um,
Good.
Yeah, so, you're seeing a lot, and we've been seeing a lot in the media with the Epstein survivors and their courage of sharing their voices. And at I Have the Right To, we believe on focusing on amplifying survivor voices. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, and I know that you and I have talked about this, but what makes survivor storytelling such a powerful force for change and why we need to amplify those voices as much as we possibly can.
And it's not just powerful, it's essential, because it disrupts and subverts the systems that have historically controlled what counts as knowledge, what counts as truth. Even if you have to say it 1,000 times from the time you're 10 until the day you die, you are disrupting the systems that want to discredit your voice, suppress your voice. Remember, this is all about maintaining gender hierarchies and power. So when survivors speak, they challenge the systems that have worked for centuries to keep voices suppressed, voices of survivors suppressed. And that disruption makes their voices politically and culturally significant. But as far as I know, the first woman, teenager, who was ever institutionalized for having been the victim of sexual violence, her name was Augustine. That was actually a pseudonym that was given to her by the asylum's director, a man named Martin Charcot. And she was not at all happy about being confined in an institution. I don't know. And she went in, she started screaming about rape and snakes. And she started screaming at the interns who surrounded Charcot, saying, "Put that snake back in your pocket." What had happened is that she had been incestuously violated by her mother's lover, her stepfather. And she had grown very contentious and had developed very unladylike behavior, and that's how she ended up in the asylum. And what happened in the asylum are two things. First, Charcot absolutely refused to consider that her symptoms, the screaming, the outrageous anger, was the consequence of anything except an internal disorder, something wrong within her. At that time, it was called hysteria. In other words, her symptoms were not the expression of what had happened to her outside, the external oppression she had experienced as a 14-year-old, right? But were rather attributed, as has been done throughout history, to something inside her. Presently, by the way, it's our amygdala that's giving us a lot of trouble, not our uteruses. I think that's plural. I was going to say uteri, but I think it's uteruses. But anyway, and so what I'm saying is that Augustine's voice was what she was trying to do is disrupt the system. She was trying to subvert the system. She was a very recalcitrant patient, Maria, and she just wouldn't shut up. And when she got too recalcitrant, too gobby, in quotes, bossy, when she wouldn't shut up, Charcot chloroformed her into submission. And I'm just tired of women being chloroformed in one way or another. That's all.
I'd love to ask, as we are part of the survivor movement, we want to do a good job highlighting the voices of survivors so that they don't end up like Agustin.
So they don't end up chloroformed.
Exactly. What do we need to include more? How can we collectively create an environment where survivors are believed and supported? What can we do?
I think there's a couple of things. We can stop using the bland anodyne terms like sexual misbehavior or sexual mischief that we still see so frequently that dilute the reality of the violence that's been done. Recently, when listening to a report about Eric Swalwell, I heard the term sexual misconduct used. We used to hear sexual misconduct used on Bill Cosby. Okay, that's got to stop. If she's experienced incest, we need to call it incest. And I don't like a lot of the other gender neutral, bland terms such that are being used in academe, for example, like ACEs. Well, she experienced an ACE. Now, what the heck does that mean? It means she experienced an adverse childhood experience. Now, I find that euphemism really rather bland when talking about a 4-year-old who's experienced incest. In other words, euphemisms are not neutral. They protect perpetrators and they make the harm much easier to dismiss. So you ask, what can we do? Precise language is not just about naming, it's a form of recognition and accountability. So in the situation of incest, we need to bring incest out of the closet and into clear view where it can be confronted. And we can't confront it without naming it.
Just wanted to ask, are we doing a good job at including the stories of incest? What do we need to include more? Because as a communications director in an organization like this, I feel that it's our responsibility to to show the stories, to change the language.
I think that organizations are doing their best. In She's Such a Liar, I have an entire chapter on women's shame. And I think, as we were speaking about before, it's essential that we deal with women's shame when they want to talk about incest, because incest, unlike other sexual violence crimes, has an ick factor associated with it. It's ickier somehow than rape, and I write about this in my book. And I think we have to work very hard to break down that ick factor. Um, and I think as much as we focus on the victim and try to help the victim with the victim's shame, the victim who feels icky, consequent to incest, we need to support and attend the victim. But when we do so exclusively, we lose fact that a crime has been perpetrated, and that exclusive focus shifts attention away from the misogynistic social and political context in which the sexual violence occurs. Many survivors that I've spoken to have felt great relief when they realize they are part of a marginalized community, a huge community, and not just an isolated girl, who was incestuously violated by her father, brother, grandfather. If we focus only on the survivor, and again, we need to focus on survivors. Incest can damage or destroy the life worlds of girls. We absolutely need that attention. But if the survivor and her story and her remediation really become the beginning, middle, and end of the story, then the crime that caused all this ends up being represented as a mere preceding event. And what we need to do is to keep the focus on the victim, but also spend much more time exploring Western social and political structures and how this has come to be. How has this machinery of disbelief been created? How is it? How are we continuing to support it?
I'm thinking even with our work with young people, and I have the right to, and Ryan, I'm interested in your thoughts even here is, when we go into schools and we're talking about this, I feel like it's much easier to get schools to agree to these conversations when we're talking about peer on peer abuse. But the moment that we start to talk about adult on child abuse, and even more so, abuse that's happening within a family system, schools get more and more uncomfortable about those conversations, even conversations around grooming, which I think are so essential to have and honestly to have pretty early. Most of my clients who were abused by family members were pretty young when it happened, but there is a level of discomfort, even the schools that are pretty open to these conversations. And I think as working in this field and the young people that we're working with, I think we need to try to push the needle there and have conversations about this as well. Like even in the scenarios that we go through with students, when we're going through different scenarios and how they might react in those scenarios, include scenarios like this, because I often think, there might be a survivor of incest. There likely are multiple survivors of incest sitting in an auditorium where we're speaking, but we're not speaking to incest. So even we in our work are making it unspeakable. And so I think even with those who are trying to do good work, like we also need to push the needle in what people are comfortable talking about.
I think, Katie, that's exactly right. I've told young people, be irritating. It's not a bad thing. You have to be irritating to get the conversation going. W- You have to make people uncomfortable. You have to recognize that it is uncomfortable. The terrain, folks, that we're entering here is uncomfortable terrain. It's uncomfortable for all of us. That, to go back to the beginning of this interview, it was as if all of my neighbors, all of my friends were waiting to talk about incest. They just wanted somebody to say, it's okay. You can talk about incest to me. I don't mind, you know. I'm not going to dismiss you. I'm not going to run from it. So I think that, Katie, eh, we have to acknowledge the ick factor, you know, and we have to say we all feel it to a certain degree, and we need to push that aside if we're going to get anywhere with reducing the prevalence of the most common sexual violence crime committed against girls in America and probably the world.
I was just going to ask you a question, Ryan. I keep thinking as I'm sitting here staring at my screen, like, in 8th grade would I have had the confidence, and the bravery to have a conversation on a podcast, and especially on a podcast where we're talking about incest, and so I would just like to hear from you how this feels or any kind of takeaways, not to put you on the spot, but any sort of takeaways you're getting from it because you really are the future and that's why we do the work that
I
we're
agree.
doing at I Have the Right To. And I know that people say that to young people all the time and it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on your shoulders. But I feel so much hope when I get to sit in a room with, students like you. So I'd love to just hear like what are you feeling? What are you thinking? How do you think your peers would take this in? Just any sort of before we wrap up, any sort of, I don't know, thoughts that you might have.
No, yeah. So, like the main thing that I was thinking is, although topics like this we were talking about it may make people uncomfortable, and Susan, you pretty much just like got right onto this. But although it might be uncomfortable, that's the part that that's supposed to happen, and that's fine. But that at some point does have to be talked about because I feel like just from the numbers and just from what we've talked about today, and I know there's so much more going into this, if there's at least 1 in 6 women that have been victimized by this, that have become a victim to incest, then it is something that 1,000% needs to be stressed upon. And I feel like just the fact that some conversations like this may be considered icky or something that makes people uncomfortable as well as a society we have to get over. And I feel like the sense of how we were talking about protecting purity in younger children, I feel like that is the ideology behind that is great. But when you think about it, what are you protecting by not telling kids what actually happens? What are you telling those kids to not talk about and to put shame to? Like,
Ryan,
sorry.
that's so excellently phrased. Please go on. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, no, you're good. Don't be sorry whatsoever. But like, when I was young, of course I felt, oh yeah, that's kind of uncomfortable. Like, why is my mom telling me this? But I feel like my mom did a great job at educating me the way that I should be educated because once again, we were saying 1 in 6 women said that were they were a victim of incest. But what about the people that don't say what actually happened to them? And I feel like that's honestly to me, it's something sorry, I'm really passionate about this. It's something just it's something it hurts my heart just to be able to say that everybody sees protecting purity as, oh yeah, don't tell them this. Oh yeah, they're too young. They shouldn't know this. But I feel like if they know that, it can protect younger kids from so much more than not knowing what's going on. Because I'm just putting myself in the shoes. Imagine if I something happened to me and I was taught to stuff like that should be shunned. Stuff like that is considered oh, why are you talking about this? Uncomfortable. Myself, I would feel like I don't have the right to talk about this. I don't want to put somebody in the position where I have to talk about it, and that's just horrible.
Ryan, you would be a great spokesperson.
Thank you.
You really would because, you know, girls who have been incested, they are typically told, don't talk about it, don't tell anyone. The shame starts right at the beginning. In fact, as I document in my book, women's shame starts well before sexual violence. It starts the day we're born because we're not the right stuff, so to speak. um, but uh, Ryan, I hope you continue to go on, and I hope you continue to pursue this passion. Be in touch with me if I can help at any time, um, because we need more voices like yours, and yours being a masculine voice is somehow particularly poignant. Um, and I think that your candor is quite winning. because most men, I say, come out of the womb feeling entitled and with a sense of impunity, you know, and the lack of empathy is mind-blowing, you know. Male researchers, yeah, they'll help me, but they didn't respond the way the female researchers did. But you have this great passion, and I think that you can really be a force for good. And I can't believe you're just in high school. I do wish you were in graduate school and about out and making your mark on the world.
Thank you so much. That means more than words can put to me. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
That's true.
If I can butt in, I just want to say not only do I agree, Ryan, I think that working with you and working with all of the other I Have the Right to interns has given me a renewed sense of hope for the future, because we see at all times all these horrible headlines of things that are happening, and you always ask yourself, is this what the future is going to be like? And then you work with young people who are willing to put their foot forward and ask and be, and it just renovates everything. Um, since we're almost at the end of our episode, there is something else that we wanted to ask to close. As you know, Chessie shared I Have the Right to with the world nearly 10 years ago. And when she came out with her story, she decided to invite people everywhere to reflect on their own rights, their voices, their agency. So I'd love to ask you, Susan, when you think about your life, your work, what you stand for, what would your I Have the Right to statement be?
I love this question. I'm so glad we have time for it. I worked on this one, actually. I would say, and I hope it will be beneficial to your community. It was certainly beneficial to me in putting the words together. I have the right to be recognized as a credible knower of my own experience. It's simple, but it's not. Because the issue is not just whether survivors speak, it's whether what we say are allowed to count as knowledge. Truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Susan, for being with us and for pushing this conversation forward in such a powerful and necessary way. For our listeners, you can learn more about Susan's work, including She's Such a Liar in the show notes, and join us in challenging the systems that keep survivors silent.
If this episode resonated with you, we invite you to share it, continue the conversation, support Survivor Center advocacy. We also hope that you consider making a donation to support our work. There is a donate button in the show notes. Your support helps make this work possible, expanding our reach into more schools, strengthening our ability to support survivors, and sustaining our in-demand internship program that centers youth voices, like Ryan's, at the heart of everything we do.
And if you're looking for ways to bring these conversations into your school or community, I Have the Right to partners with K-12 schools, colleges, and universities to provide trauma-informed programming on consent, healthy relationships, and leadership. You can reach us at takeaction@ihavetheright2.org. Thank you for being part of the Aspire community, for listening, learning, and showing up for a world where everyone has the right to safety, dignity, and voice. Until next time, keep aspiring toward change, and remember, you have the right to be heard. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at ihavetheright2.org.